here at meeting number 48. And we're welcoming here today this Communication Security Establishment, CSE, who is part of our study on cybersecurity and cyber warfare pursuant to Standing Order Section 1082. So joining us for the first hour, and I'm not going to be able to give us the full hour because we're starting 10 minutes late, so we're going to do 55 minutes this round and 55 minutes the next round with our next set of witnesses. So we have Sami Kohari, who's the head of the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity, and also Ali Tayeb, who is the Deputy Chief of Signals Intelligence at CSE. So I'm open up the floor, and you have 7 minutes to bring your opening remarks between the two of you.
Hello, bonjour. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee for the invitation to appear today. My name is Sami Kohari. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the head of the Communication Security Establishment, Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, known as the Cyber Centre. I'm joined today by my colleague, Alia Tayeb. She's the Deputy Chief of CSE's Signal Intelligence Branch. Je suis heureux de me présenter.
I'm pleased to appear before the committee to discuss cybersecurity and cyber operations.
First meeting of your study, I'd like to begin by providing an update on the current cyber threat landscape and what CSE is doing to protect Canada and Canadian. I will largely focus on the cybersecurity aspect of our mandate, whereas my colleague, Ms. Tayeb, will focus on the foreign intelligence piece of CSE's mandate, our support to partners, and active and defensive cyber operation capabilities. Now more than ever, we understand that cybersecurity is the foundation of Canada's future for our digital economy, our personal safety and privacy, and our national prosperity and competitiveness. In October, the Cyber Centre released its third National Cyber Threat Assessment. This report outlines the current cyber threat environment.
One of the main points raised by the assessment of national cyber threats is that cybercrime remains the largest cyber threat facing the Canadian population, and essential infrastructure is the main target.
Specifically was prominent in the past 2 years, and it remains a persistent threat to Canadian organizations. The state-sponsored cyber programs of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea continue to pose the greatest strategic cyber threat to Canada. In the face of these threats, and as Canada's technical and operational authority on cybersecurity, CSE defends Government of Canada networks, and the Cyber Centre leads the government's response to cyber incidents. However, cybersecurity is not solely a federal government responsibility or concern, as cyber threat continues to target and impact Canadian individuals and organizations. The
CSE works with industry partners, including non-governmental partners, to exchange information on the threat and best practices when it comes to cybersecurity. The Centre for Cybersecurity publishes notices and expert advice for Canadians.
Moving forward, to continue to adapt to the evolving threat environment, bolster defenses, and help better protect Canada and Canadian, we're hopeful to see the continued progress of Bill C-26, an act respecting cybersecurity in Parliament. This legislation will establish a regulatory framework to strengthen cybersecurity for services and systems that are vital to national security, and public safety, and to give the government a new tool to respond to emerging cyber threat. We also look forward to continued work to support public safety in our renewal of Canada's national cybersecurity strategy. The renewed NCSS will articulate Canada's long-term strategy to protect our national security and economy, deter cyber threat actors, and promote norms-based behavior in cyberspace. For the
CSE, the renewal of the strategy is an opportunity to continue with the achievements of the Cybersecurity Centre over the past 5 years, because the creation of the centre was one of the main initiatives of the 2018 strategy.
To build relationship with Canadian industry and other levels of government, we are also focused on collaboration with our international partners in the Five Eyes and beyond. I will now hand it over to my colleague, Ms. Tayeb, to speak to her area of responsibility.
Thank you, Sammy. As my colleague noted, I'm the Deputy Chief of CSC's Signals Intelligence Branch, and I'm also responsible for foreign cyber operations aspect of the CSC mandate. My pronouns are she and her. As mentioned, the severity of cybercrime and cyber incidents targeting Canadians and Canadian critical infrastructure, both public and private, is growing exponentially. Beyond cybercriminals, however, state and state-sponsored cyber actors also pose a continuing threat to Canada. Through CSC's Foreign Intelligence Mandate, we continue to provide intelligence on foreign cyber threats, including the activities and intentions of state and non-state actors, which is used by government clients, including the Cyber Centre, to defend Canada. Recognizing the evolving threat landscape, the CSC Act came into force in August of 2019, which allowed CSC to expand its tool suite to conduct active and defensive cyber operations, together referred to as foreign cyber operations. Depuis qu'on lui a accordé ces
Since it's been giving new powers, the CSC used its capabilities linked to cyber operations to deter the efforts of extremists based abroad seeking to recruit Canadians.
Disrupt the activities of cybercriminals planning ransomware attacks. Recognizing the importance of investing in cyber resilience and bolstering Canada's capability, Budget 2022 provided Canada's first standalone investment in its cyber operations capability, earmarking $273.7 million over 5 years and $96.5 million ongoing annually for CSE to build its foreign cyber operations capabilities and conduct a specific range of cyber operations focused on countering cyber criminals and protecting Canadian critical infrastructure from cyber attacks. En vertu de son mandat d'assistance,
because of its assistance mandate, the CSC also used its capabilities to support the Canadian forces. Our allies, our international partners, and our adversaries all invest massively in these capabilities and develop their cyber operations on a large scale. It goes without saying that the CSC is carefully monitoring cyberspace and adapts its efforts to protect Canada and its interests.
Continues to evolve, CSC is dedicated to advancing cybersecurity and increasing the confidence of Canadians in the systems they rely on daily. With that, I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you for your opening remarks. We'll kick off the first round of 6-minute questions. Ms. Glant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to, first of all, put a motion on to notice, and I believe the motion will be distributed, that the Standing Committee on National Defence invite the Minister of National Defence, the Honourable Anita Anand, and the Deputy Commander of NORAD, Lieutenant General Alain Pelche, to provide a briefing of no fewer than 2 hours concerning the foreign airship from the People's Republic of China that recently violated Canadian airspace, and that the briefing be held in public within the next 4 days.
You have the floor. You have 5.5 minutes left.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Through you to the CSE, how and when was the CSE made aware of the Chinese balloon in our airspace?
Thank you very much for that question. I think as the Minister spoke over the weekend, she indicated that we've been working very closely with our U.S. allies on this matter, particularly through NORAD, who had been tracking this, I think, higher altitude balloon and monitoring its activities since last weekend, I believe. But I think it would be better placed for the CAF to answer more specifics on that question. Thank you.
So has the CSE been made aware of similar instances in the last 10 years of incursions?
From the balloons?
Correct.
I'm unsure of how to answer that question at this time without getting into what could be intelligence or operational details. So I would have to defer to my Canadian Armed Forces colleagues on this question. Thank you.
Well, did the CSE play a role in electronic warfare or blocking or jamming the devices attached to the spy balloon?
Again, I apologize that I'm not able to answer your question. I hope you can understand that in matters of intelligence and operations, I wouldn't be able to provide any further details on this question.
Okay, so Let's get back to the first question that wasn't answered. When exactly did the CSE learn of the Chinese balloon in Canadian airspace?
I wouldn't want to provide you an incorrect answer, so if you'll permit me, I could verify that information exactly and return to the committee.
I'm not interested when the armed forces. I'm interested when CSE first learned of its existence.
My understanding is it was sometime over the 2 weekends ago. I'd have to get the date for you exactly, but I'd rather be precise and return to you with a more detailed answer.
Return in writing with that answer, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely.
And how did this CSE learn? Was it of its own equipment, or were they notified by another part of the government or the National Defense or NORAD?
Again, just to be absolutely precise and not to mislead anyone at the committee, if I could return to you in writing on that question, that would be very appreciated.
Okay. Well, given the unknown nature of the payload of the Chinese balloon, whatever it was carrying, was there an additional risk of cybersecurity or cyber warfare that were or were not addressed by the CSE?
I can. What I can say is that we do work very closely with our U.S. allies, in addition to the Canadian Armed Forces and all other Canadian agencies who would have been monitoring this event. And we would be monitoring for any risk to Canadian information, Canadian assets, Canadian infrastructure in partnership with those agencies.
Okay. Now, you haven't clarified how you found out, but if CSE learned of the balloon the same way most Canadians did, through the news, how would you advise changing any of the protocols related to the incursions into Canadian airspace?
I very much appreciate the question. I think it's an extremely important one. I don't think that I'm the best place to answer that question, given that I think the Canadian Armed Forces would be best placed to handle questions of that nature.
Is CSE concerned about the ongoing research partnerships between Canadian universities and China's National University of Defense Technology, recently reported in the Globe and Mail?
Indeed, we, as part of our foreign intelligence mandate, do report on any foreign activity that is directed, any foreign adversary activity directed towards Canadian, including approaches to our research work or intellectual property or economic investments. So that is absolutely a topic that we would be monitoring and reporting on to our government clients.
How did you learn about the July 8th network-wide Rogers outage?
I think I would perhaps best turn that one over to my colleague, Sammy.
Thank you for the question. We monitor. We have good partnerships with all of the telecom operator, and shortly after the outage, we were in touch with Rogers to just ascertain the nature of the outage.
Did you call to ask, or did they initiate the conversation to let you know what was happening?
I actually called to ask.
Okay.
Ms. Lamberopoulos, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here to answer some important questions with us today. My first question is that it's come to me. I understand that CSE is working with its partners in Ukraine in order to determine whether there are cyber threats, if cybersecurity.
Excuse me, we don't have translation interpretation. She has the wrong headset on. Yeah, make sure you. Yeah, it's positioning on her mouth. Please just speak normally without. Try that. Just test 1, 2, 3. I stopped the clock.
All right. I'm hoping that you guys can hear me.
Okay, thumbs up.
There might be.
No, it's not good enough.
Monsieur le Président, est-ce que je peux vous demander de...
Could I ask you to ask the member whether she has the correct headset? Because we just got a directive from the House that we have to make sure that the right headset has to be used to protect the hearing of the interpreters.
Lambropoulos, is that the correct headset that's been issued by the House of Commons? It is. Can you just wrap it naturally around in front of your face and just bend it over and then try that, please? Test?
Yes, does this sound better and clearer?
No, they're giving me the thumbs down.
Can we pass it to another colleague, and I'll try to get to a space that's a little bit easier to hear from.
Okay, I appreciate that. So, Ms. O'Connell, you can have the 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. I think the work that CSE does is really important, and probably most Canadians don't even realize the quality of our services here and the technology. So I appreciate the opportunity to actually hear a little bit more about and share with Canadians a little bit more about some of the work you do. And some of the issues that are very topical, of course, in the media too, are private sector ransomware attacks. Where I'm from, outside the GTA, and Sick Kids Hospital was in the news for sure and had a lot of reporting on that. So could you maybe speak to the process or what role CSE can play when there's a private sector non-governmental ransomware attack, or how you try to work with clients, or the mandate or non-mandate that you have in dealing with private sector attacks?
Thank you for the question. Happy to speak about that. So ransomware, when we issued our third National Cyber Threat Assessment, we continue to highlight the threat of ransomware poses to Canadian organization. It's a serious threat as we can see it in the healthcare sector and critical infrastructure and businesses and so on. There are a number of ways that we work with the private sector to mitigate or to address the threat of ransomware. We constantly publish alert and cyber flashes to draw attention to maybe new vectors of ransomware or new techniques that cyber criminals are using in ransomware. It's every time we have an opportunity to speak to a to a business community, we speak about the threat of ransomware. Sometimes we get tips that, whether our partners have seen precursor of ransomware, being deployed in Canada, and we will tip the organization and tell them you might want to look here because we have information to indicate that there might be precursor of ransomware. Unfortunately, sometimes we either hear through the media that there is ransomware, that a certain organization has fallen victim to ransomware, or
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I'm just limited on time. But following up on that, is there any requirement for private sector, for example, to notify the Canadian government of something? I could see some businesses might not want to share that they've been vulnerable. Is there any sort of requirement, or what do you do in that event? Or is there something that you can recommend even to this committee as we take on this study in that area? And again, apologies for interrupting. I'm just limited on time.
Thank you. There is no requirement for the private sector to report to us ransomware incidents. And many of them don't report it. As a matter of fact, in 2021, we've only had the report of about 300 ransomware incidents to the Cyber Center, which is probably underreporting for a number of reasons. So as soon as we hear of an incident, we reach out to offer our assistance. Sometimes it's accepted, but more often it's declined.
Thank you. And following up on that, critical infrastructure, this is an area of particular importance, but I'm curious, as my colleagues here know, I was in municipal government before, and looking back at my role there, we really were not briefed, and municipalities or regional municipalities often hold a lot of the responsibility over water systems, some critical infrastructures, might be bridges in some cases, depending on jurisdiction. But what work is being done to ensure all orders of government have the proper training or tools needed within their organization to even be aware of what the threats might be, since they often hold kind of the responsibility or authority over critical infrastructure?
Thank you for the question. We have a number of programs or regular engagement with the various critical infrastructure sector, including municipalities, where we hold regular calls with them. I personally get invited to speak at their annual events or at their conferences to share with them what is the latest threat that we are aware of or that we're seeing or that's affecting them. So we do have an outreach program through our partnership team that is constantly out there talking to municipalities, to critical infrastructure operators, to the healthcare sectors, and so on, to try as much as possible to offer them, make them aware of what are the services of the Cyber Center.
Thank you. And
merci. Pour ce qui est de la rétention des talents, le CST est en concurrence avec...
And we're getting French interpretation on the English channel. Okay, try again.
Is this working? Is interpretation working? Thank you. Just on retention or recruitment, I would assume we'd be competing in this space with, Silicon Valley, et cetera. What is the strategy to ensure we continue to retain and recruit the best talent in this space?
Thank you again for this important question. Recruitment is challenging and it's a highly competitive space out there. We are trying to hire for a number of positions, for a variety of positions, and to ensure that we hire Canadians who represent the rich and diverse society that we live in. We are modernizing currently our multidisciplinary recruitment effort to attract those top talents, investing into a student program and a co-op program to make sure that our talent pool is rich. We are very engaged in communities to raise cybersecurity awareness, presentation to students to get them interested in the STEM field, but also investing in retention of our current workforce. We have been named as a top employer 3 years in a row.
Time has expired. Madame Normandin, 16 minutes.
Ms. Normandin, 66 minutes, please. Thank you very much. Thank you for your presence. I will piggyback on Ms. McConnell's questions because I'd like to hear you about the similarities between what you do and what's been done at the Canadian Forces, because we had some testimony about certain issues and about the labor force. I'd like to hear you about the risk that is involved in the difficulty recruiting labor and how the private sector is very competitive. Does this present security challenges? We're very aware of the challenges of the current labor environment, but the fact remains that we try to attract talent from various parts of Canada. We don't focus only on the National Capital Region. We try to hire across the country. We try to hire various levels of expertise and hire the student level or co-op level, not just career professionals joining us. We hire people who bring a lot of talent to the organization. That's where we focus our efforts. We're also exploring the possibility of hiring people who would remain in the regions, not just move to Ottawa. They would remain in the regions and provide cybersecurity support more locally. Thank you very much. I couldn't sidestep the elephant in the room with the McKinsey problem and subcontractors. There are many informatics services that were offered. I'd like to know whether this is the type of contract that CSE uses, and if so, how can we make sure in a context where these clients have many clients that security is guaranteed? First of all, do you use that kind of firm? And if so, how does it impact security? Thank you for the question. To my knowledge, we do not use contracts with that particular firm, but I could confirm that in writing after the committee hearing. When it comes to the security of contracts, each department has a responsibility for safeguarding its information. We establish standards for security for various types of contracts, not individually, but let's say standards. But it's up to the departments to respect those standards. I hope I've answered your question correctly. Okay, I understand that in the case of McKinsey, there's no contract, but do you have contracts with other firms? Not to my knowledge. We do not have contracts with other firms, but I could get back to you on that if need be. I'd appreciate that. Thank you very much. I'd like to know what they are. I understand that you sometimes have defensive cyber operations that require ministerial approval. How fast do you receive those authorizations? Are there ways to be more reactive or more efficient on certain files if there's a situation XYZ arises? Yes, thank you very much. That's a question for me. We're always looking for methods to improve our processes. Up until now, it's usually investments that we made in our program recently that allowed us to have greater capacity to work with our colleagues in the Department of Global Affairs. That's very important in our process for approval.
For precision, I think what's important here is that we work very closely with our colleagues, both in the Cyber Center and with our our Department of Global Affairs. They are responsible with us for to provide assistance and advice in terms of our operational planning. But we have been able to respond very quickly to threats as they have emerged. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Another issue that the Canadian Forces are confronted with is the difficulty in procurement. It's very long. Authorizations for security. I'd like to hear your views on these two aspects. To obtain leading-edge material that's useful in a certain project or to get security authorizations for potential employees, there are very long, overly long delays. Yes, perhaps I could begin to answer that question. The supply chain, of course, was impacted by the pandemic, and we're suffering as much as other departments when it comes to acquiring electronic equipment or networking equipment to increase our capacity. So we're aware of that. We try to work with companies to accelerate the delivery of some of these products, but we're affected nonetheless, like all other clients of these companies.
Ms. Matheson, you get the last 6 minutes in this first round.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I wanted to pick up actually where Madame Normandin had been in terms of discussing those contracts. I mean, they are certainly top of a lot of our minds as of late. Mr. Khoury, in terms of that information, that those recommendations that you make to a lot of those departments, government departments, critical infrastructure, and those contractors that are handling specific delicate information, private information, sensitive data on behalf of government, how do you provide them with those best practices, and how do you monitor how they follow that in each department? You said that they have to do it themselves, but do you play a role in all in that provision and monitoring?
Thank you for the question. I mean, we come up with the various information security standards that are out there, like Protected A, Protected B, Protected C. We communicate those standards. They're sort of promulgated through Treasury Board. And with each of these levels of classification, departments are aware of sort of what goes in what what information is classified at the protected B or at the protected C, or what is secret, what is top secret. The departments themselves have to live by those standards. We don't audit them per se. Sometimes we get pulled into specific projects, and at that point we provide some security advice to the project and ensure that the information security of the project is commensurate with the classification of the information. But we don't review on a contract by contract base what is the information being provided to the contractor. But I'm talking about it from from an IT perspective, because my primary concern is cybersecurity and IT security.
Right. But in terms of those private contracts, and they would have access to delicate information, so there isn't really, other than the department monitoring it itself, you don't see, nor does CSE see any of potential problems within departments? They don't have any obligation or accountability to report to you?
Each department is assigned, or each department has a departmental security officer. We have a communities of those that meet on a regular basis. And Treasury Board is the policy arm of our community, and we would work with them to ensure that the information is promulgated as much as possible. But we don't go and audit departments and understand how is it that they are handling the information at the proper classification level.
Do you see that as a potential problem, though, that may be something that we could recommend going forward, that actually there is more communication between those departments and CSE or your center specifically, in order to better have information on problems that could be happening across departments with sensitive information?
Thank you again for the question. I think departments know how to reach out, whether it's to Treasury Board or to us, if there is any clarity being sought on what is the proper classification of information. I've personally been in a number of conversations where we talked about the level of the classification of the information at hand and what is the proper security profile that we need to apply to the IT system in order to protect that information. Those forums exist today, and those channels exist today.
So, I mean, you're quite literally, it's in your name. You're the center. You're supposed to be bringing a lot of this information together. So my concern is, for some of these contractors, if you were to see patterns, I mean, that would be more helpful, I would assume. But in terms of those companies who may be repeat violators of those best practices in terms of cybersecurity for those departments, would you be able to see those patterns? But also, we have seen in the United States, for example, a company like Deloitte has actually been seen to release very, very sensitive information in 2017. They had a massive data breach in the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, the State Department, the National Institutes of Health. They leaked passwords and IP addresses and that sensitive information. So when you see that happening internationally, and then those same companies are being used here in Canada across the board within our own government, do you provide any of that feedback or any of those warnings? Do you recommend not using those companies that have had these problems? Do you monitor that? Do you track that? Do you provide those recommendations?
Thank you again for the question. I would defer to PSPC on anything that has to do with contracting. Our role is very much to review the security architecture sometimes, and we would work with them. And departments have the responsibility to do the SANA of their system, so the review, the security accreditation of their systems, and we get involved in those accreditations. So before the system goes live, obviously, if it contains sensitive information, the department will have to accredit it that it has met the security baseline that the Cyber Center has established. And sometimes we are part of the project, so we get involved in that. Repeat offenders and contracting issue, I would respectfully defer that to PSPC.
And we're going to have to cut it off there, slightly over on our time. Ms. Cramp-Newman. You have the floor. 5 minutes, please.
Perfect. Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the witnesses. First question. Due to the competitive nature of cyber employment opportunities, is it safe to assume, or is it accurate to assume, that the Canadian securities establishment struggle with acquiring employees with the actual skills that are required to combat cybersecurity and cyber warfare?
I could maybe take that one from the beginning. I think it's a great question. It's something that we talk about a lot at CSE and the Center for Cybersecurity. We're lucky in a way. Statistics-wise, we do have a great deal of interest in our organization. We have an interesting mission. A lot of people are interested in this topic. With our Cyber Center taking a more public profile, we've certainly developed a greater inroads into the public in terms of awareness, and that has translated into a great deal of interest in working here. We hire a variety of people from different technical fields, so it's not all one type of profession. We have engineers, mathematicians, cybersecurity experts, etc. So we also have a wide variety of jobs available. Having said that, I think as Sammy indicated earlier, it is a competitive space, and so we do need to innovate, and we do need to make sure that we're keeping up with our competitors in this space. So that's why some of the initiatives that we've taken on in terms of making CSE an excellent place to work, and all the initiatives that it takes to become a top employer in Canada, providing an environment for people to be innovative, and also fostering an inclusive environment where we can continually bring in new people to this sector who might not have considered it before, particularly women or individuals from different ethnic origins.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So just in the nature of time, I'm going to keep going. So
Sure.
We know that there's a lot of remaining challenges with regards to financial compensation or what have you, but I'm going to move along to, as bodies are continuing to change their mandate, how do you see the relationship moving forward between Cyber Command and the Canadian Armed Forces? And how do you think how can we ensure that we're optimizing both their areas of expertise and their resources?
Thanks very much. That's a fantastic question. We've found an excellent partner in the Canadian Armed Forces in terms of what we call force generation, of developing a new workforce to be interested in the cyber domain. We also CSE also works very closely with U.S. Cyber Command in this field, and we do talk about workforce strategies in terms of building the expertise that we need in order to have successful tools to meet the challenges of the future. Thank you.
Thank you. So we recognize that one of the CSE's central aims is to carry out active cyber operations. So my question is, given the different bodies such as Foreign Affairs, National Defense, would CSE be operating independently or in conjunction with these different bodies?
Indeed. Thanks for that question. We definitely do not work independently. We work very closely with the Canadian Armed Forces and the Department of Foreign Affairs. Department of Foreign Affairs, in fact, is required for active cyber operations. The Minister of Foreign Affairs is required to provide her consent for those operations. We work very closely in the planning and the development of those operations and assessing the risks. And on the CAF, we essentially have a combined workforce where we have embedded officers into both areas so that we continue to work effectively on this aspect of our mandate.
Thank you. Earlier in your testimony, there was comment with regards to recruitment being highly challenging and that the retention of the current workforce is extremely difficult. So perhaps you could allow you to continue with those further comments. Or perhaps it was your colleague that was speaking to it. Struggles with the retention.
Thank you. No, actually, I meant we are investing in retention and making sure that we continue to be an employer of choice to provide our staff with an environment where they can thrive, the training opportunities that they need. So we are also our retention.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but one last question. So just so we're not repeating yourself, do we have currently enough personnel to fully meet the operational requirements?
Thank you again. We are constantly hiring, and the demand on our services is growing. So we are busy hiring as much as we can.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Lamropoulos, let's try this again. You got 5 minutes. Well, let's do test first.
Yeah, that would be great. I think now you should be able to hear me a little bit clearer.
Yeah, I'm getting a nod. Go ahead. You got 5 minutes.
Okay. So thank you for being with us today to answer some of our questions. As I was about to say earlier, the CSC is working with partners in Ukraine to monitor, detect, and investigate any potential threats, cyber threats, and to help them take measures to address any of these threats. Have we seen Russia using these cyber operations in order to harm Ukraine during this war? And can you tell us if this has had an impact on Ukraine's ability to defend itself? And also if we can draw any lessons as Canadians from this.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I'll take a first stab at it and maybe turn to my colleague Alia for the follow-on. But before the invasion of Ukraine started, we have been communicating to our partners the threat of Russian cyber activities. Russia is a formidable cyber actor. And we have been communicating to as much as possible for people to take the threat seriously. From a Ukrainian perspective, they've been the victim of Russian cyber aggression since 2015, 2016, when they affected the power grid. Over the years, Ukraine has been building resilience. And with the help of the West tipping them off, they have fended a number of cyber attacks that the Russian has sort of unleashed on Ukraine in the early days of the war. We have learned a lot from these cyber attacks that Russia has unleashed on Ukraine. We have quickly turned around and published or issued cyber flashes so that in case there is any spillover effect in North America or at least in Canada, we are prepared to share as much as possible with critical infrastructure and businesses what are some of these indicators.
Okay. Would you like to add to that, Ms. Tayeb?
Yes, indeed. Maybe just to further from the aspect of your question in terms of what we've seen Russia do in Ukraine, I think there's been a considerable amount of information, including in open sources, really documenting the Russia's use of cyber tools against Ukraine in this most recent conflict, and the use of those cyber tool attacks, cyber threats against Ukraine in conjunction with their kinetic attacks. The most prominent example being the disabling of satellite communications over Ukraine, in the lead up to the war. So for us to observe that what we would call hybrid warfare, the use of cyber tools along with kinetic tools have been well documented in this conflict. I think both the Cyber Center and in fact Microsoft did an excellent study on mapping out those two capabilities and how they were used together in this conflict.
Okay, thank you. And based on what you're telling me, of course, Russia is a great actor in this regard. You mentioned in your opening remarks that cybercrime is the most likely threat to impact Canadians, and there are quite a few actors that pose a threat, including China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, that pose the greatest threats. How do these actors differ in their goals, their capabilities, their goals and their capabilities?
Thank you for this question. We have called out those 4 nation states in our third national cyber threat assessment. They have a variety of motivations to go against Canada by targeting Canadian individual, by compromising some technology through worldwide campaigns, by targeting Canada's economic value, or by pursuing financial gains. So, for example, we know that Iran is using cyber criminal tools to avoid attribution. This is one of their techniques. China is going after, research, technical data, business, intellectual property, military capabilities. North Korea is very much interested in enhancing its economic value by stealing credentials and then stealing funds. So they each have a motivation to conduct those activities, or at least to go after a certain aspect of Canadian society to further their own interest.
All right, Ms. Tayeb, I see
you have
that
less than
you have
30
your...
seconds.
Oh, Okay.
So-
Would you like to add to that? Just we have 30 seconds.
No, I think Sammy described it well. We are constantly surveying this space in terms of looking for new tactics and techniques that are used by ransomware actors against to target Canadians. And it is an evolving space, and it is something that we require dedicated effort to following up to make sure that we can continue to protect Canadian infrastructure.
Okay, thank you both.
Thank you. And now we'll go to our 2.5-minute round. Madame Normandin.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'd like to hear your views about the collaboration between states. We know Canada's part of the Five Eyes. There's a policy about cyberspace where states are asked to account for malicious activity. Is the sharing of information going well with other countries, or is there a quid pro quo at work here? Are they a little bit chilly about sharing information? How does the collaboration with other countries look? Thank you very much. Between the Five Eyes, it's a very effective sharing method. We are partners. It's very open. We're combating all the threats that we've discussed today. Very close relationship with our Five Eyes partners in those countries and their organizations. In addition, we have other partners, other countries in the world with whom we share information on threats that affect us all. So I'd say that these are good relations in this area. Sammy perhaps has something to add. Yes, I'd like to add a few words. When it comes to cybersecurity, we're part of many different communities of information sharing. Of course, in the Five Eyes, we share a lot of information, but more broadly, we exchange information with emergency response teams worldwide. Wherever we see malicious activity, we send them a note so that they can take measures locally to neutralize the threat, if you will. When information is given in Five Eyes, is it given to all 5 countries, or is it bilateral sometimes? On the whole, perhaps both. It depends on the kind of threat and who's affected among the partners. So I'd say it depends, but perhaps Sammy would have something different to add.
We're going to have to move on to our next 2.5-minute question. Ms. Matheson. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Ms. Taib, you mentioned in your opening statement, you talked about the expanded powers that you have. And a lot of folks were, of course, concerned about that, that expansion of the fact that your department can collect information on Canadians themselves for research purposes, and then there's no requirement to release that information. It's there forever. There were a lot of course, human rights, civil rights organizations that were concerned about the use of that data being used against folks in terms of when they're collecting, exercising their rights. Could you comment on, because there's also a lot of concern in terms of the oversight of that and the accountability of that and how you're monitored continuously now that these laws have been in effect for several years?
So thanks very much for that, and allow me the opportunity to just clarify a point if I misspoke earlier. To be clear, CSE is not permitted in any way, shape, or form to target Canadians or any individuals in Canada. So that's a basic prohibition, and that extends to our foreign intelligence mandate and our cyber operations mandate. I believe I was referring to, in that space, the interest would be on the foreign actor. If the foreign actor is targeting Canadians, we'd be interested in what that foreign actor is doing that would be harmful to Canada. So that's a very specific prohibition. In terms of review, absolutely, we are reviewed. We have 2 review bodies, the NSIRA, the National Security Intelligence Review Agency, and the NSI COP as well. We also have an intelligence commissioner who approves our ministerial authorizations to ensure that they're in keeping on the foreign intelligence side, that they're in keeping with our charter obligations, and to maintain and to ensure the privacy of Canadians should any information on Canadians be collected incidentally. So we have that. We have both oversight and consistent review in all aspects of our mandate.
20 seconds. Except that within the CSE Act, you are allowed to research activity of Canadians nationally and domestically, are you not?
No, we are not.
Mr. Kelly, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Corey. Less than a year ago at committee, you said that that state-sponsored cyber programs of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran pose the greatest strategic threat to Canada. Do you have any comment or anything that you might want to add? First of all, is that still the case? But do you have any comments on non-state actors?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The assessment that we've reiterated in our most recent national cyber threat assessment is that those 4 countries, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, continue to pose the greatest strategic threat to Canada. As far as non-state actors, obviously cyber criminals is a threat that we have to contend, that we have to address. There's also, as a result of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we've seen a number of state-aligned hacktivist group. So these are cyber criminals that have sort of flown the flag of, have taken sides, and there's a number of ransomware affiliates who have decided to align themselves with Russia as a in the conflict. So taking sides.
So
these are always things of concern.
So are you saying that these state actors avail themselves of mercenary type services from international criminals? Is that?
There is, in some cases, there's close relationship between state apparatus and some of these cyber criminal organizations.
Okay. Also in the report, there was a recommendation number 10 on the report that followed from your last appearance, said that the Government of Canada recommended that the Government of Canada invest in defensive and active cyber operation capabilities. As well, the government should increase its recruitment and training of cyber specialists for the CAF and for the CSE, and ensure that all federal systems are adequately protected against cyber threats. What action has been taken within your department on that recommendation number 10 of the report?
Maybe Alia can take the first part. And
Indeed, and I'm just like, I don't have that report in front of me, but indeed, for the first recommendation in terms of investing in active and defensive cyber operations, as I indicated in the budget announced in 2022, we did.
Okay.
I can address, maybe in the meantime, I can address the second part of that recommendation, which is defending government system. So we are constantly we're constantly monitoring government system. We are updating them with the latest threat indicators. We work closely with SSC and with Treasury Board on making sure that government IT is very well protected. And also, as a result of the NSI COP recommendation, we are working with the small departments of agencies and crown corporations to bring them into the fold of the defensive capability of the Cyber Center.
Okay, thank you. What about the Privacy Commissioner, your Office of the Privacy Commissioner? You earlier, in a response to an earlier question, you mentioned that there is not a requirement for businesses to report ransomware or hacks or loss of data. They are required to report that to the Privacy Commissioner. Do you take cues or do you work with that office to determine threats or in furtherance of your work and your agency?
Thank you for the question. No, we don't. We don't get tipped off by the Privacy Commissioner. Businesses have an obligation to report to a number of bodies. Sometimes it's a Privacy Commissioner. Sometimes it's regulatory bodies. We reach out as soon as we hear of an incident. We always reach out to the victims and offer our assistance.
So you have on your own just monitor the media or monitor or just it seems that there must be a better way to ensure that you are aware of hacks or ransomware attacks and these kinds of things as they happen.
Thank you. We are made aware of incidents through a variety of means. Media is being one of them, but we also have partners who tip us off, and sometimes the victim themselves reach out to us to inform that they've been a victim of a cyber incident. So we are aware of through a number of ways of victims, but the coverage is not 100%, of course.
Thank you. Time has expired, and I'll just say that when you appear in person, the screen never freezes up. It's cyber hacks can't get at you. Final questions to Mr. May. Can't hear you. Make sure you're unmuted. Try again.
There we go. Can you hear me okay, sir? Thank you kindly. Your point taken as we have trouble there hearing me today. I want to first of all thank the folks, the panelists, for being here with us today and getting us off on the right foot on this study. My questions are going to be around Russia and Ukraine and with the beginning of the Russians' invasion of Ukraine, and particularly as we've seen significant material support from Canada and of course many NATO allies. We heard, of course, warnings that Russia may retaliate against NATO with cyber like attacks. Has that threat materialized in your opinion in any way?
Thank you for the question. The threat has not materialized in a direct way, but the threat has materialized through some spillover effect. So the case that my colleague Alia brought up. So Russia went after satellite communication against Viasat, and as a result, there was some Western entities that were also users of that service. So as a result, their communication got disrupted. Russia's intention was to disrupt Ukrainian communication, but the spillover effect was bigger than Ukraine. So we've seen those kind of threats materialize. We've also seen state-aligned those hacktivist group who have aligned themselves with Russia go after Western government, most notably through DDoS attacks in Germany and other places as a way of registering a message.
Mr. May, you're not coming through.
For some reason, my little fob here isn't working very well. Can you hear me now, sir?
Yes, go.
Thank you. Given that, do you have can you maybe spend a moment to share with this committee maybe the strategies or how Russia uses cyber warfare against Canada, and has that changed over the last year?
Thank you for this question. We've seen, as I mentioned, Russia is a formidable cyber player. We've seen the extent of their capabilities in Europe, or at least in Ukraine, with the deployment of cyber capabilities that are destructive in nature. We've seen them use them against Ukraine by shutting down the power grid over there twice. We are very concerned about that, and that's why we work with critical infrastructure providers in Canada to make sure that they are taking every precaution or every measure to protect themselves, and their networks from those kind of cyber threats. So everything we learn, everything we see in Ukraine, everything we learn from what Russia's doing around the world, we try to promulgate it through cyber flashes and other information bulletins to Canadian businesses.
In that regard, how does CSE assist work of the Canadian Armed Forces, particularly in the area of intelligence gathering and counterintelligence?
Sure, I can take that one. We work extremely closely with the Canadian Armed Forces in terms of intelligence provision. We share all intelligence that we collect with them, whether it relates to threats to their armed forces deployments abroad or internal threats to Canada that would affect the Department of National Defence. So we have a very close working relationship there. In terms of other forms of cooperation, I did speak about foreign cyber operations and how we work very closely with them on that mandate. I would add that we also, under our Act, have an assistance mandate, which is explicit that we can provide assistance to the Canadian Armed Forces. In so doing, would be operating under their mandate, but we can use our technical skills, abilities, and capabilities to assist them in their operations if they were to make such a request. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think that's my time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. May. And just to follow up on that, just exercising a little bit of my chair prerogative, when you are assisting Canadian Armed Forces in their activities, as well as what CSE is doing under their new mandate since 2019, does that include both defensive and offensive postures?
The nuance with the request for assistance part of the mandate is we would act under the Canadian Armed Forces mandate and authorities. So it would be to the extent that they have the authority to do something. So whether it be active or defensive in nature, we could assist them insofar as their authorities permit.
Just also drill down a little bit more about protecting Canadian infrastructure. How much do you work with our cyber or with our public sector as well as private sector partners like financial institutions, transportation hubs, healthcare systems, things along that line that are definitely would be considered soft targets by your adversaries?
Thank you for the question. We work extensively with the private sector and the public sector. Again, we have a number of engagement forums where we are briefing them regularly. For example, with the healthcare sector, it's every 2 weeks that we have a forum with them to brief them on the latest threats. And there's often over 500 people on a call. We have more intimate collaboration, for example, with the banks or with the electricity sector or with the natural gas provider. So we tailor our engagement to communities that share either similar infrastructure or similar technologies or similar capabilities. But we are talking to almost all 10 critical infrastructure sectors in Canada.
Very much. I want to thank both Mr. Corey and Ms. Tayeb for joining us today. That was very interesting and a great way to kick off our study on cybersecurity. With that, we're going to suspend. I'd ask that the next round of witnesses please come to the table and log in online so that we can continue on in an expeditious manner. Here we go. So we have for our second hour the Center of International Governance Innovation, and joining us is Aaron Scholl, who is the Managing Director and General Counsel, who's joined by video conference, and Dr. Wesley Wark, who is the Senior Fellow and is sitting with us at the table, which we really do appreciate. So each of you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. I have Mr. Scholl going first.
Sure. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to the committee for having me. I'm honored to appear before you today to discuss the critical issue of cybersecurity and the capabilities of foreign actors. To effectively address the issue, I believe that the government should take a multi-pronged approach. So now I understand the urgency of the issue. So rather than discussing the current state of cybersecurity, and we'd already heard from the previous two witnesses about the various threats we face as a country, let me begin at the end and offer a few thoughts of what I think you can actually do about it. So I've had the benefit of reviewing my colleague Wesley Wark's comments. So I'm going to focus on a different set of prescriptions, though I will say I agree with what he's going to offer. So first, I think the government should incentivize companies to adopt the latest security measures, such as the cybersecure standard established by ISED and CSE for small and medium organizations. The standard provides a high level of protection, but its adoption, and this is the problem, its adoption has been limited. Implementing a tax credit system as an incentive to help increase the overall level of cybersecurity in the country and reduce the risk of cyber attacks on businesses would be a way forward. And these attacks result in significant financial loss, damage to reputation, and the disruption of operations. And so if we were to advance this, we can attract investment and we can increase productivity and profitability. The standards are already there. Too few companies are doing them. And there's that old saying, you cannot herd cats, but you can pick where you put the food out. So incentivize those businesses through a tax credit. Second, the government should establish a clear and concise legal framework for dealing with cyber attacks, which includes guidelines for attribution, response, and liability. But the governance structure should be nimble and responsive to the fast-changing environment, and the regulation should be expert-driven, focusing on sound policy and not good politics. The governor in council should be able to approve standards, codes of practice, and certification programs to act as an integrated compliance mechanism. Third, the government should establish an annual multi-stakeholder platform for collaboration and engagement on cybersecurity issues. This platform should include participants from all levels of government, private sector, indigenous communities, academia, not-for-profits, law enforcement, and industry leaders. In my view, cybersecurity is a whole of society concern for Canada, and everyone, including think tanks, need to do more to address this issue. As a consequence, my organization, CG, plans to host the first Waterloo Security Dialogue in June to bring together various stakeholders and focus on discussions and simulations to better understand the impact of cyber incidents, response and recovery measures, and the roles and responsibilities of different parties. Now, let's talk about the threats. As previous speakers have mentioned, there are active persistent threats, and APTs, as they're called, are coordinated and highly targeted cyber attacks, often carried out by state actors who aim to steal sensitive information or disrupt critical infrastructure over a long period of time. You've got ransomware, and we've talked about this already as well too, and that's that malicious software that encrypts a victim's files and demands payment for a decryption key. But there's also now something called double extortion, where they threaten to release very, very sensitive information. Not only is your information locked up, but they threaten to release the sensitive things to either embarrass you or to push you to payment. Then we have supply chain attacks. And supply chain attacks occur when an attacker actually compromises the software or hardware of a supplier to deliver malicious code to its customers. And probably the best known one of these in recent memory is the 2020 SolarWinds incident, where that popular IT management software was used to compromise thousands of organizations. We also have election interference and foreign actors using cyber means to hack into voter databases, spread disinformation, manipulate social media, all with a view to influence public opinion. And we also then have critical infrastructure attacks, which had been talked about, but the Ukrainian power grid, this was a great example of a critical infrastructure attack having a real world effect where In 2015, 225,000 people were without electricity. So now the full capabilities of states will certainly vary, but here's my view. In light of current geopolitical trends, I believe the safest operating assumption for Canada is that we will be existing in a gray zone for the foreseeable future. And what I mean by gray zone, I'm actually going to adopt the definition from Canada's defense policy, which I actually thought was the best definition that I'd seen. And here it says, state and non-state actors are increasingly pursuing their agendas using hybrid methods in the gray zone that exists just below the threshold of armed conflict. Hybrid methods involve the coordinated application of diplomatic, informational, cyber, military, and economic instruments to achieve strategic or operational objectives. They often rely on the deliberate spread of misinformation to sow confusion and discord in the international community, create ambiguity, and maintain deniability. So, in conclusion, my own view is that this is a whole of society concern for Canada. It's not just about government, it's actually about governance. And I believe it's our collective duty to better prepare the country for an existence in this gray zone. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for your opening comments. Dr. Work.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. I'm grateful for this invitation to appear and give testimony. The terms of reference of your study touch on many facets of the cyber threat, but I will focus on just one here in the 5 minutes that I have in the opening statement, and that's the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It has provided important real-world insights into the ways in which cyber weapons can and will be used in wartime in conjunction with more conventional military attacks. This alignment was first exemplified in the Viasat hack of satellite-based Ukrainian communications on the opening morning of the Russian invasion, and you've heard previous speakers from CSE mention that attack. What do we know of events since that time? That's since February 24th, 2022. Let me take you to two open source studies, and I've provided links to these studies to the clerk of the committee. In June 2022, CSE's Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity produced a threat bulletin that cataloged significant Russian cyber activity in conjunction with military attacks on Ukraine for the period from February 2022 through to May 2022. Among the key judgments in that CSE bulletin were that the scope and severity of Russian cyber operations were more sophisticated and widespread than had been reported in open sources, and that beyond the Ukraine theater itself, Russian cyber threat actors were engaged in widespread cyber espionage campaigns against NATO countries and looking to develop further cyber capabilities against such targets, including Canada. In January 2023, the Ukrainian Cybersecurity Agency released a report, translated, fortunately, into English, using a methodology very similar to that employed by CSE that documented the scale of Russian cyber attacks and their alignment with conventional bombardments from February through to November 2022. A key finding in the Ukrainian report concerns the ways in which Russian cyber attacks have targeted energy infrastructure in Ukraine as part of a ramped-up Russian effort to destroy Ukrainian sources of civil power supply and undermine morale. According to the Ukrainian Security Service, SBU report, Russia carried out on average more than 10 cyber attacks on Ukrainian critical infrastructure, energy infrastructure, per day in November 2022. Ukraine's cybersecurity leadership wants the world to recognize the reality of cyber warfare as they have experienced it. They urge a common approach to cyber aggression, the use of sanctions to undermine the cyber capabilities of an aggressor, the need for enhanced sharing of information about cyber threats, and a clear designation of cyber attacks on civilian critical infrastructure as a war crime, along with a determination to pursue accountability for such crimes. How should Canada respond to this set of appeals? I would suggest the following. First, ensure that CSE is able to provide the maximum possible aid to Ukraine in terms of signals intelligence and cybersecurity support. Second, the Government of Canada should continue to provide financial support to ensure the resilience of Ukraine's cyber systems. Thirdly, along with our allies, we should be using targeted sanctions to undermine Russian state and proxy cyber capabilities. I think we should also continue to document and publicly call out Russian cyber aggression against Ukraine and NATO. I would urge us to take a lead role in supporting Ukraine's call to designate cyber attacks on critical infrastructure as a war crime in international law and assist Ukraine to pursue accountability. And finally, we should ensure that we maintain a robust capacity to monitor and learn from the use of Russian cyber weapons against Ukraine. This should include research support for Canadian academic and NGO studies and engagement with expertise in the private sector. We have learned, Mr. Chair, three things from the Russian cyber war against Ukraine. First, that civilians are prime targets. Secondly, that cyber weapons are not precision munitions. And thirdly, that cyber aggression knows no rules or bounds. Worse still is what might be waiting in the wings, the looming possibility of another, and I'm going to refer to this operation, it's in Russian, NotPetya malware attack with global ramifications. NotPetya was a Russian GRU, that is military intelligence agency, hacker operation launched in June 2017 against Ukraine. It morphed out of control, as many of these malware attacks will do, crippling global container shipping. It was described by one Homeland Security advisor to the President of the United States as, I quote, the equivalent of using a nuclear bomb to achieve a small tactical victory. The cyber nuke outcome is one we must strive to avoid, just as we strive to avoid escalation to nuclear war over Ukraine. Mr. Chair, I'll conclude by saying I hope this doesn't sound too much like Dr. Strangelove. Thank you.
Very good opening comments. I appreciate both testimonies. And with that, first round, 6 minutes, Ms. Kramp-Nyman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Wark, thank you for your testimony. I'll start my first question with you. In what ways do the tensions in Russia increase the need for more resources and military defense supports to ensure Canada can effectively compete on the international stage?
Thank you. Through you, Chair, I didn't quite catch it. I think the question is about defensive capabilities or armed forces capabilities. I think that there would be I'd certainly agree, and probably the conventional view would be, and we shall see, what the government decides in terms of its upcoming defense review update. But I think the view will be that the armed forces needs a lot of new equipment to be able to engage effectively in any future conflict, including along with allies and in support of our own sovereignty. So there is a great deal we have to do in that area, and I think we all recognize the Canadian Armed Forces lacks a range of things from sufficient manpower through key military capabilities, and many of these have been called attention to. And I must say, just as a private citizen, the fact that we were only able to supply 4 Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine struck me as a kind of terrible symbol of the ways in which our military's been allowed to be degraded over the years. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll continue. So lack of manpower, lack of morale. And in addition to that, there's growing concerns that Canada is being left behind in the Five Eyes relationship as the UK, US, and Australia continue to collaborate. How has this worsened in the past 10 years, and how can Canada reestablish a relationship?
Thank you for that question. I'll go in a slightly different direction. I'm not sure I entirely agree. I would say that I would make a distinction between perhaps our military capabilities and the way that they've declined in our intelligence capabilities, particularly on the signals intelligence side and our contribution to the Five Eyes. I think Canada, through the CSE, is regarded as a key actor in the Five Eyes, and it is regarded with respect. We're regarded, I am told, by Five Eyes counterparts as one of the leading countries in terms of our ability to provide cybersecurity for federal data infrastructure and communications, and we're regarded in that respect with respect. I think the challenge for Canada is just keeping up in the face of a wide range of threats. But we are regarded as a key player in the Five Eyes. There are always things that the Five Eyes would like us to do more of. There's been consistent pressure for decades for Canada, for example, to create a foreign intelligence service, a human agency, which we've always resisted. But on the signals intelligence and cybersecurity side, I think we're a strong player.
Okay, thank you. Switching gears, addressing my next question towards Dr. Shull. There's been growing concerns of the use of social media and the information Canadians willfully provide international companies on our cybersecurity. how does social media consumption make us easier targets for these international cyber threats?
Sure. I mean, well, there's traditional cybersecurity, which usually is unauthorized access to systems and data. But what you're talking about, and I really like the question, goes a little bit deeper to societal resilience. Here we're talking about people and people's views of the world. And so when we think about disinformation, misinformation, or malinformation, the point here is that people are persuadable. I mean, there are sophisticated influence campaigns that are taking place all the time to try and change our discourse, to sow societal division, and to pull people in different directions when we need to be uniting. And the point here is that many of those capabilities are commercial off the shelf, right? And so the most highest profile example was the 2016 election in the United States, where the Russians got involved. But the point here is that the system didn't malfunction. Yeah, it functioned as it was built. And so that's what we've got is social intermediation with platforms sitting at the middle of our social discourse, and their incentive is profit. Their incentive is eyeballs. And so that's what we've built for ourselves. It's a bigger conversation than just the cybersecurity stuff, but it's a great question.
Thank you. And just to add to that, what kind of access or power are consumers providing companies when agreeing to these terms and conditions?
Oh, well, that could be the subject of a PhD dissertation. But I would say this, if you were to try and read all the terms of service that you've agreed to all year, there's some estimate that it would take you something like 200 days, like the average individual 200 days. So I think their broader point is we've built our entire system based on consent, which is a fallacy. It's a lie. The fact is we don't know what we're consenting to. And the case in point, one company stuck into their terms of service that if you agreed to their terms, then they would own your soul forever. So now there's one company in San Francisco that just doesn't know what to do with all the souls that it owns.
And going back to yourself, Dr. Warwick, with having you in the room, how do you see Canada's current investment and infrastructure compared to other countries, like the United States, for example?
Sorry, could I just say investment in infrastructure? Could you just be
with comparison to other countries like the United States?
I would say we have a long way to go in deciding what we want to do about critical infrastructure. And let's put it that way. We're waiting for a critical infrastructure strategy, which has been under study by the federal government. You will have seen a reference to Bill C-26, which refers to critical infrastructure, but we have a list of critical infrastructure that dates back to 2009. In other words, it hasn't been updated since that time, which was the last time we had a critical infrastructure strategy. So the starting point is going to have to be to decide what we mean by critical infrastructure. And once we've done that, and that'll be an important step, but not easy, once we've done that, then we can think about regulating the terms by which critical infrastructure functions and what we expect of them in terms of particularly cybersecurity strategies. There's some of that underway, obviously informally. Some aspects of critical infrastructure have done a terrific job in terms of ensuring they have very high levels of cybersecurity, and probably the major banks are a key example of that. But across the board, it's a very, it's a very diverse system.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Mr. Sosa, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for your presentations, both of you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you highlighting some of the issues as it relates to the war in Ukraine and Russia and the various actors out there and foreign bodies that are creating stress for all of us. But you did talk a little bit about the cognitive warfare, right? The misinformation, that sort of issues that are also prevalent and creating some havoc. Not necessarily a tactic by which they're holding us ransom, but by feeding us misinformation. Can you tell me, besides the foreign actors, how prevalent that is in our domestic soil?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chair, I would say first of all, we're coming up with a kind of more sophisticated understanding of what's going on in the information space. So it's important, I think, to understand that we make distinctions between three different kind of categories of information out there that may be troubling to us. One is misinformation, which is defined by CSE, among others, as information which is false, but not deliberately disseminated as being false. In other words, someone believes it even though it's untrue. And there's, of course, a great deal of that, and a lot of it circulating on social media channels. And we saw its impact, for example, in the Freedom Convoy events in Ottawa and across the country earlier this year. the other two forms are disinformation, which is defined as information often deliberately put out by foreign state adversaries, which is deliberately deceptive and untrue and designed for various reasons to undermine the state of a society. And there are certain actors out there, including Russia and China, that I think are particularly good at disinformation. Russia has taken a lead, and we've seen a lot of that in the Ukraine war. And then there's a third category, which I think really deserves a lot of attention, which CSE and its American counterpart have defined as malinformation, which is a kind of gray area between disinformation and misinformation, kind of the manipulation of information that's partly true, partly false, to achieve certain objectives. So we're coming up with a more sophisticated understanding of how these different aspects of false information circulate and impact. But I think we're only at the beginning of a study of this, and it frankly is very difficult to know what to do about it, other than to try and block foreign state actor activity.
Yeah, so the concentration is strictly on the foreign side. You're not looking directly or as much as what's happening domestically here?
Well, I think in terms of intervening in the domestic space for political discourse, that raises important charter protection issues. It's much more straightforward, if technically still very complex, to deal with something that is clearly improper and illegal, which is foreign state activity. And this is why CSE, among other departments of the federal government, have a mandate to deal with foreign state disinformation.
So how effective is AI and quantum technologies? Is this part of the thing that the foreign states are, these state-formed cybersecurity measures are being taken?
AI is certainly an enabler, artificial intelligence, and it's being used already in various ways. Quantum computing and quantum applications, I think, are for the future, and I'm no expert on them. And frankly, I hope not to be here when they're finally introduced, but they are for the future. So we can speculate a lot about what they might look like, but we're not there yet.
Are we winning against these cyber threats from Russia and China?
It's a good question through you, Mr. Chair. I would say I think we're holding our own. The reason I think it's particularly important to pay attention to the Ukraine war is it's a laboratory for cyber warfare. It's really the first significant laboratory we've seen. And everything that's being used by Russia against Ukraine and the way that Ukraine has responded, I think, is very important for us as a matter of study. And we're in a fortunate position to be able to study this.
And Ukraine is being effective in their counterattacks on this?
They are. I would say they are. Partly because they've had long experience of these since going back to 2014 and the initial Russian incursion into Crimea and elsewhere. So they've been ramping up their capabilities, not only developing domestic capabilities and having popular support to do that, but they've had a lot of assistance from key allies in the West and from all of the Five Eyes partners.
I got a minute. All right, well, this is great. So when you're looking at the infrastructure that's being deployed by Canada relative to some of these efforts by foreign players, are we then, I guess we're partnering with other states. Are we partnering now with NATO and others to enable us to fight cybersecurity collectively? And in so doing, are we exposing ourselves yet to other actors?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think it's an interesting question. I think the key alliance network in which Canada participates and where we are able to do significant work is the Five Eyes partnership. I think many of the Five Eyes members, some of them at least, are also members of NATO, Canada, US, UK. So it spills over into NATO. But the Five Eyes is the key partnership for enhancing cybersecurity. And a lot of work is going on there, I think, behind the scenes. Just very quickly, I would just like to draw the committee's attention to one of the problems we have in Canada, which is that CSE has a certain mandate, and you'll see it in their cyber threat assessment that CSE officials mentioned, which is they want to talk about strategic threats to Canada. That is foreign state actor threats, because that's in their mandate. There's a whole other world of threats to Canada and Canadians, including through cybercrime, which is not CSE's issue, and it is the issue of the RCMP. And this is just a plea to the committee, if you have the time in this study or in future, we really do, I think, need to have a look at how the RCMP is able to deal with this vast world of cybercrime and its impacts.
Thank you.
Monsieur Désolé, bienvenue.
Mr. Desilets, welcome to the National Defense Committee. Did he say 16 minutes? 6 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you to our guests. I'm new here and I find this fascinating. It's a worrisome topic nonetheless, but with a great deal of future in it. My first question is for Mr. Schul. In your opinion, these cyber attacks that we're seeing in small doses that we'll probably see more and more, could this be considered war crimes?
It's a very good question, and indeed, senior members of the Ukrainian government have called for the offensive cyber activities in the Ukraine to be considered war crimes. At present, likely not, and certainly it's not necessarily something that had
La qualité du son ne semble pas adéquate pour
The sound quality is not adequate for the interpreter.
Make use of Mr. Schul. Can you guys understand?
No, the sound's not good enough for them to
I can understand, but I can't respond.
Can you make sure your boom is down in the right place on your microphone, and please speak up louder? Try it again, please.
Is it possible to translate now if I speak slowly?
Anyone?
So
No.
there is a call from.
It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. They've said no.
So we're going to have to, unfortunately, can't take any more testimony from you, Mr. Scholl. The audio is not good enough for interpretation. So I've stopped the clock. Unless you want to log back out, exit the screen, log back in and see if you can get your audio working better so that we can hear you here for proper interpretation. Monsieur Desilets, if you want to direct your questions. Okay. Brian, we can't hear you either. You're muted.
Oh, I wasn't speaking to you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
If you're going to give me the floor, I'd be happy to chat, but that's up
Not
to you.
this time. Monsieur Desilets, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Desilets, please. Oh, is the sound okay in your opinion? Are we starting again with the same witness? No? Okay, so we'll go on to the other witness. That's what I understood. It's Mr. Wark. My first question for you is this. We've been talking about McKinsey a lot recently. Given that this company also has links with China, do you think that could have a security impact, a national security issue?
Mr. Chair, thank you. I'll respond in English. I'm not an expert in contracting, and I hesitate to answer. I do think that the answer that you had from CSE is probably the most appropriate one. That this is in terms of the security of contracting, that is a matter for PSPC, and it's one, in my experience as an occasional contractor, not on the scale of McKinsey, that they take very seriously.
OK. Vos travaux ne se comparent pas à ceux de McKinsey.
Your work cannot be compared with that of McKinsey. Is that what I'm to understand? Okay. You alluded earlier to the Five Eyes and Canada's position, Canada's involvement. How would you criticize it, or how would you comment it? Is it sufficient? Is it adequate? Where are we positioned?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's a very interesting question, and it's hard to answer precisely from anybody who has an outsider status like myself and has not taken part in Five Eyes meetings or communications. My understanding really is that, Canada's been member of the Five Eyes and really was key to the expansion of the Five Eyes system. Our membership goes back to 1949, so we've been part of this grouping for a very, very long time. And our principal investment in the Five Eyes has always been in the signals intelligence and cybersecurity fields. We've expanded beyond that over the years as the Five Eyes themselves have expanded. I think that there is a greater contribution that Canada could make in a variety of fields to the Five Eyes, and that raises the perennial issue, for example, of a foreign intelligence service and what additional information it might provide to Canada. There's also a role that other Five Eyes partners look to Canada to play, which we're on occasion able to play, but probably not to the strength that we should, which is in terms of assessments of global security threats. The threat assessment piece is an important piece for the Five Eyes, and Five Eyes partners like to get multiple perspectives on complex, developing global threat issues. We have some capabilities in that regard, but I think we could use to invest a lot more in the analytical side of the intelligence business, which often gets a lot less attention than the collecting side, the signals intelligence or the agent on the ground side.
Intéressant. Vous avez parlé.
That's interesting. Earlier you talked about the three kinds of false information that circulate. I liked your categorization of that. You talked about disinformation, inaudible. That's an interesting point. We saw this kind of disinformation on another scale. What can we do, in your opinion? Is there anything to be done about this kind of deliberate disinformation that might be communicated by the Russians or the Chinese? Maybe allies, too, sometimes. I don't know.
Thank you for the question through you, Mr. Chair. I would say that we probably should be worried most about adversaries that are deliberately conducting disinformation campaigns and interfering in democratic practices. A lot of our attention has been paid since 2016 to the possibility of election interference because that's so fundamental to democratic practice. There's a lot of attention as well to the ways in which foreign state adversaries can use cyber tools to try and impact on diaspora communities in Canada and among our allies. You know, I think there are perhaps three effective things that we can do in that regard. One is probably the most important thing is to monitor and call them out publicly, and call them out as a form of deterrence for foreign state actors trying to use those tools, but also call them out in terms of in making sure that the Canadian public understands what's going on. We do that on occasion. We're doing it more often than we've done in the past. There's always sensitivities about calling out things because they can have diplomatic repercussions, so it can be complicated. But I think calling out is an important thing. And I think public education is a critical part of the piece. But I will also say that trust in Canadians and trust in the ability of Canadians to make some common sense decisions ultimately about what is clearly false and what is information that's being circulated on behalf of a foreign state is also an important but perhaps underemphasized part of the equation. So this may be the optimist in me, but I continue to have some faith in public sense. And I always like the example of what the French government did in response to their concerns about election interference in a national election in 2016, which is that they created a special office in the president's office, that was designed to introduce kind of satirical commentary about clumsy Russian disinformation campaigns, to make fun of them. So I think that's a great tactic. Thank you.
And Ms. Matheson, last 6 minutes to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Glad to see Mr. Schulbeck online. But I think my questions could be for both witnesses. I'd like to actually continue on a bit from where Ms. Krem-Nyman had been discussing that commercial, and I think, Mr. Schull, you had mentioned that discussion about that profit side of social media and the dangers of that, and of course the algorithms that are specifically used and written to bolster those profits, but to really put forward more and more of that misinformation or sometimes online hate. We've seen that directly. So if you could comment on that in terms of what role the government needs to play in terms of the regulation of that and the responsibility of those private corporations to not use or profit so much on those algorithms.
Sure, and I'll just see if the translators are able to pick me up now.
Not at all?
Is it not?
Unfortunately, we're not getting the go-ahead.
Perhaps he could submit those responses.
That's a good idea, is if you can submit your answer in writing, to the committee. Just forward it to the clerk, and then we will have your feedback on that basis. So, Ms. Matheson, let's move ahead.
I would actually offer the same question then to Mr. Wark as well, which I would have before.
Through you, Chair. Thanks for the question. It's actually a running joke between Aaron and myself about the fact that occasionally CG, which is at the heart of Canada's cyber universe in terms of research, seems to have some difficulty connecting. But anyway, I would say that I think one of the things that Aaron and I have discussed and have focused some attention on, so I offer this as a partial answer, is the universe of social media communications is increasingly being affected by automated bots. These are simply machines out there that amplify according to certain algorithms certain kinds of messages, and they can be used for disinformation purposes by foreign state actors. We saw this with Russia in the 2016 election campaign against the United States. It can be used by social media companies to boost ratings. I think the conclusion we've come to, without having the tools necessarily to suggest how you do this, is that we have to tackle the automated bots issue in some form or another to reduce their impact and the scale of use that is made of them.
In terms of, and it was interesting, and it's a bit, it's linked. I was informed, and there was a presentation that I had received about how we see personal information going forward and people's rights of usage of that personal information. And it was suggested that at whatever point people be paid to surrender that personal information to a Facebook or to social media, to any of those forms. Is that potentially a future way forward in terms of that compensation, so people know more of what they're getting and there's like a contract almost?
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, I would say that this is something that successive privacy commissioners have been particularly keen on pursuing in an effort to, and not just federal ones, but provincial ones, including the previous Ontario Privacy Commissioner, to trying to build a better model for consent that doesn't require us, as Mr. Scholl suggested, reading through hundreds of pages of abstruse technical language, which none of us do. So we clearly need a better model for consent, and we clearly need better restrictions on efforts to use consent on the part of social media companies. And I think there is a real role for the Government of Canada to play in that regard in terms of setting guidelines, as challenging as that might be, because social media, the giant social media platforms, will not like it. But it's something I think we do have to tackle.
If I could just switch a little bit, there was discussion previously, and Mr. Scholl, I know you cannot contribute, but we can have a discussion, I guess, about what you put into testimony, just in terms of providing more incentives for small businesses to up their game, I guess, in terms of cybersecurity. In the previous panel today, Ms. O'Connell was actually asking about what municipalities needed to do as a tax on that infrastructure, how they are being provided with supports and advice and what have you. Would you argue, I guess, Mr. Work, to give that response, would you argue that needed to be provided, that support needs to be provided to municipalities, other levels of government as well?
I'm sorry that Aaron can't take that question, so I'll try and answer on both of our behalves to the best of my ability. I think the suggestion that Mr. Scholl made about tax incentives is certainly one way forward. Regulation of at least what we might determine to be critical data infrastructure and communications is another. Bill C-26 may have an interesting impact in that regard, depending on what Parliament does with it, but it's certainly worthy of study. I think the conclusion that we've come to, and which CSE has also spoken to, is that while there are pretty high levels of cybersecurity capabilities, awareness, implementation on the part of major private sector actors in Canada, including the financial sector and other aspects of critical infrastructure, the real problem is with small and medium enterprises, who neither have the resources nor perhaps even the understanding of the degree to which they're vulnerable to cyber attacks. And so we need to find, I think that's the area of focus, those small and medium enterprises, figuring out ways to help them up their game in terms of cybersecurity in ways that are affordable and understandable to them. I think that is the challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. Time has
Mr. Chair.
expired. We're going to move on to
Mr.
our
Chair.
5-minute round.
Sorry, before you move on, could we just ask the witness, Mr. Schell, if he can answer via writing to the committee? Because I think these are important questions.
He's not online anymore, is he?
He is. He's turned off his camera.
Okay, so he's listening in, and so we'll make sure that
Thank you.
Schell, if you can respond to all these in writing would be.
Assuming he wishes to.
No, it's
Yeah,
a little more
if he
work,
wishes
but
to.
we do appreciate the input. So moving on, 5 minutes, Mr. Kelly.
In addition to or maybe an expansion of some of what you said in your opening remarks, can you give us some description of the impact of a successful cyber attack, potential successful cyber attack on civilian life in Canada?
We've seen Mr. Chair, thank you for the question, Mr. Kelly. We've seen a few examples of attacks on Canadian holders of data and private information over the years. We haven't seen at this stage crippling attacks, I would say. Probably the worst of the attacks that we've seen goes back a number of years now, and that was the hack into the National Research Council, which took a long time to rebuild systems in response to that attack. So we're learning as we're going, and this is, again, why I think... So I don't have an example to offer you other than these isolated incidents, but we're learning as we go.
Okay, during the study that took place less than a year ago, well, it was a broader study, but that we did look at cybersecurity, there was discussion about the gaps that exist between the Canadian Armed Forces and the Canadian security establishment. In that time since, would you say that the gaps still exist? Have they been adequately filled, or what are the gaps between our institutions?
So, Mr. Chair, I think I'd answer in respect to that question. It'd be interesting to hear from CF Incom in particular on that, because they are the organization within D&D which is most affected by developments. What we've seen recently, and it was highlighted in the Defence Strong, Secure, Engaged strategy in 2017, and perhaps will be reinforced in the update whenever that appears, is that the Canadian Armed Forces have decided that they need a much enhanced capacity to engage in cybersecurity and have cyber capabilities for their own offensive and defensive operations. So they have been attempting to build up an independent, standalone capability in that regard. Under their own mandate. CSE has been able to assist them, but it's not so much that there are gaps between CSE and CF Incom as I would understand it. It's more the question of how well has the Canadian Armed Forces and particularly CF Incom been able to build up that cadre of cyber warriors that they need.
You talked about resources, too, a little bit in your opening statement. And, I mean, we're very familiar with the extraordinary cost of ships and jets and tanks and whatnot. What are the... Is there a budget shortfall or are there additional budget demands necessary to successfully... undertake proper cybersecurity? Is it more a question of hiring the right personnel, or are there hardware and important budgetary items that cost money that we're deficient or should budget for in the future?
Thank you. I think the answer to that question is probably everything comes into play. I mean, I think that the key challenges for CF Incom in particular in building up its capabilities are partly technological, having access to the best kinds of systems that they'll need, and also in terms of human resource capabilities to find that kind of talented pool of either civilian or armed forces members who can contribute to a kind of cyber cadre within the Department of National Defense. So in that respect, they face the same, although perhaps magnified challenges that CSE faces in terms of kind of maintaining the workforce, which has been the subject of questions here and CSE has responded to. I think it's a particular difficulty for CF Incom. And it's also the case that armed forces are not necessarily institutions that change rapidly culturally, and we've seen this in many respects.
I've got less than a minute left. Then what these systems that you say we need access to, what kind of budget is necessary to ensure we have the adequate systems in place?
I couldn't really answer that question, to be honest. I'm not sure it's a huge price tag. It's just being able to identify the systems and acquire them is probably the key challenge.
Speed of procurement is a factor then.
We're running out of time here, and we've got to be judicious in these last few minutes. Mr. Fisher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. We've heard a fair bit today about critical infrastructure. Ms. O'Connell asked about it in the last panel, and I think Ms. Kramp-Nyman talked about it as well. I'm wondering particularly how certain sectors could be a target for state-sponsored cyber attacks as a means to attack Canada without the use of conventional military means. I'm interested in your thoughts. I'm interested in both of your thoughts, but perhaps one we'll get in writing and one we'll get from Mr. Wark. But I'm interested in the sectors that you see as being under the greatest threat. I think about the Rogers outage, and I think about how that impacted people all across Canada. I think about natural disasters like Fiona, and it outlined our reliance on power, telecom, gas, ATMs. The fact internet was once a luxury, now it seems to be a necessity. You can't do a thing when something like this happens. So I'm interested in your thoughts, Dr. Wark, on which sectors you see as the greatest, being under the greatest threat.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'm going to surprise you perhaps by saying that there is one sector which we have not typically considered being part of critical infrastructure but need to consider in the future, and that's space. Because increasingly we're going to rely on space-based platforms for critical infrastructure, communications, monitoring of climate change impacts, a whole range of things. My hope is certainly that in the forthcoming critical infrastructure strategy the government is working on, that they will include space as a new sector. But I would say that is probably the most vulnerable area because it is so new and because it is changing and developing so rapidly, and there's a Canadian role to play there. So space is a big one. The other thing I would say is that signals intelligence agencies, CSE and other Five Eyes ones have said, look, what we're facing are probing attacks at the moment by foreign state adversaries, trying to figure out how our critical infrastructure systems work and where their vulnerabilities are. Will we actually see attacks on those systems short of war? That's very hard to know, and probably the answer is not likely because it has such an escalatory impact. But there are certain aspects of it, in particular in terms of democratic practices in election infrastructure, for example, which can be vulnerable. So I would say space and those critical infrastructure systems that feed our democratic needs around elections in particular. They're two key issues.
Thinking about Fiona in Atlantic Canada, does a natural disaster provide an opportunity for someone to see an opportunity for a cyber attack? And acknowledging the reliance on things like energy sector, like things like banking systems and such?
That's an interesting question, Mr. Chair. I don't really know the answer to it. I think for those adversaries that might be paying attention, it would be a sort of thing to look at to see how well a country can respond and recover, where the vulnerabilities might be exposed in terms of critical infrastructure, communications, services, and so on. But it's probably more in the field of study than anything else.
Okay. We talked a little bit about conventional warfare, and we always say that the war of the future won't look like what we're seeing in Ukraine on the ground. But you also, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, you used in conjunction or hybrid or those things. And then I think it was you that said the scope of Russian cyber threats is very sophisticated. But what we're seeing is a lack of success by Russia, with regards to the war in Ukraine. I just wonder your thoughts on that hybrid warfare, because we've said for years that it's not going to be the battlefields of yesterday where we see wars, but yet we're seeing this little bit of a hybrid now with some cyber, some disinformation, and some traditional conventional warfare.
It's a fascinating question. I mean, I think the thing that the Ukraine war reminds us is that a lot of it looks like the First World War at the moment, and there's always that element of sort of brute force and machine on machine and man on man, woman on woman in combat these days, which we mustn't forget. I think the expectation going into the outset of the Ukraine war was that the Russians would be more sophisticated actors, both in terms of conventional military capabilities and cyber capabilities, and they haven't proven to be either, fortunately. That's not to say that they're not trying to learn and do better, and the outcome, obviously, of their war in Ukraine is very much up for grabs at this stage. So, we have an inclination to overinvest in fears of future of warfare and technological change and so on, but it's important to look at that.
Thank you.
Time has expired, and we've got 5 minutes left, and we're going to split that half and half between Monsieur Desilets and Ms. Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your French was excellent, by the way. Now, given what my colleague was saying, I would like Mr. Schul to answer 3 questions in writing. First of all, could a cyber attack be considered a war crime eventually? That's my first question. The second is, if there was a significant major cyber attack against a NATO country, what could we expect as a reaction? Would it be perceived as an attack against NATO? And would NATO be at war? And my third question is quite a broad one. Mr. Wark referred to recommendations that he'd like to see in the report. Mr. Schul, would you have any recommendations that you would like this committee to include in its report? Up to you, Mr. Wark. Now, I'd like to get back to my last question earlier about disinformation. I find this extremely dangerous, and we're seeing it in spades. I'm a former school principal. I'm thinking about young people and education, prevention that should and could be done in our schools to allow them to distinguish between what's true and false. But let's set aside the prevention and education aspect for the moment. To your mind, what is the responsibility of the media, and what is our responsibility as elected officials?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would say that the media plays a huge role. Of course, the media as an institution has changed before our very eyes in the last couple of decades. There's the mainstream media, and there's everything else that's out there. And I would say that the mainstream media has a strongly embedded code of practice and ethics to try and ensure that they are reporting as they see it truthfully and holding themselves to account. That is not, of course, the case for actors in social media who have no such code of conduct. It really depends, I think, at the end of the day on the ability of ordinary Canadian citizens to be able to decide where they want to get their sources of information from, and hopefully not purely in an echo chamber kind of fashion. Just get their source of information from places which confirm pre-existing beliefs. And my hope is that many Canadians ultimately will be able to do that.
I'm going to have to cut you off there. Ms. Matheson, last question to you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Wark, interestingly, in a previous study, we were talking about Arctic security, and we had Professor Byers here. And one of the biggest things that he said that we had to absolutely focus on, and the government had to focus on, was the entire replacement of the radar sat constellation system. That was one of his biggest points. Can you speak to that, whether you agree, disagree? Big point. Thanks.
I'll be very brief and refer you to an Auditor General's report recently on Arctic surveillance, which I think made the very important point that the Canadian practice for procuring new satellite capabilities, particularly ones that can assist in monitoring our Arctic space, both for military purposes and for civilian purposes, is a very slow-moving one. And we face a circumstance in which current satellite systems like RadarSat and the trio of satellites may go out of operational capability before we're able to replace them. So there is this gap between kind of long-term D&D planning for replacement of these systems, space agency planning for replacement of these systems, and when they may run out of capabilities. And that gap, I think, clearly has to be closed. The RadarSat constellation is a very important attribute for Canada. And I think overall Canada needs to invest much more heavily in satellite-based capabilities for our own needs.
1 minute. And then sort of, I guess, to jump a bit, so we've talked a lot about the needs in terms of having the right personnel, having the people within cybersecurity to do those jobs. Is Canada doing enough? Can the government of Canada to do more in terms of training those people? And I know that that's a bit of a catch-up, but what can be done in terms of the investment in people coming into these jobs from the government?
I think that'd be an interesting question perhaps for CSE officials who have their own training systems within CSE, to the extent to which they are able to migrate those training systems out to other federal government departments and agencies. I don't know. Out to the private sector, I don't know. I suspect it's an important gap that you've identified.
Thank you. And time's expired. And I just apologize to Ms. Glant and Ms. O'Connell that we weren't able to get your questions in. Mr. Ork, Dr. Ork, I should say, as a Canadian who's proud of my Ukrainian heritage, I appreciate all your comments about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I found it interesting that you said that a cyber attack in Ukraine should be considered a war crime. Just a quick yes or no. Is a cyber attack on a foreign nation an act of war?
It's not clear in international law, I think, is the simplest answer. But I think Canada can take a lead. We've always taken a lead, or like to think we've taken a lead in terms of international law developments, particularly at the International Criminal Court. And I would like to see the government of Canada stand up and support the Ukrainian position on this and say that war crimes against civilian infrastructure, cyber attacks on civilian infrastructure is a war crime.
Okay, thank you very much, Doctor, and Mr. Scholl, I thank you as well. I know you're listening in. Just to remind committee members that our Friday meeting will be again on cybersecurity and cyber warfare, our study with academics, and next week we'll be meeting with DND and CAF officials. With that, do you guys want to keep sitting here, or are we out of here? We're adjourned. Piece of